getting there. I think we're getting there. There we go. Now we're getting answers from you guys. Let me get rid of this right here. Take the volume down on that just in case. On that. And let's refresh something here. Smash. Well, there's a whole bunch going on in chat now. There we go. She's catching up. Catching up now. Catching up now. Let me refresh something real quick so I can see what you guys are typing. Audio is a little low. How about if I talk a little bit louder instead of mumbling? Hey. Check. Hey. Hey, how you doing? There we go. Alrighty. So now we've got that working. I feel like an old fart working with this thing. So this is like my first like live stream on YouTube. I've done it on something that was older way back in the day. I can't remember what it was called even, but it was different. So let's go look at where we done, what we done, where we're going, all that good stuff. Just kind of like usual, right? Oh, let me put that on mute there. Bang. Course outline. So hopefully everybody got my email. It said we've moved. Lab number 1 is going to be due Friday. Like what, 11:30 p.m. I believe is the time I set. So 11:30 p.m. Friday, lab number 1 is due. So if you got any questions, you can send them. What I'll probably do is we'll take a look at the last few little questions in lab number 1. Those are probably the hardest, where you bring in the file and then I tell you to look at the playback cursor. We'll kind of talk about that today too. And we'll look at menu structure as well. So you should have read lesson 3 for today. Creating your first Pro Tools session. That's what we'll talk about. Kind of already done that before. We did that. We should be doing that in lab number 1, and as well as we did that for a little hands-on quiz. So everybody should be practiced up on that. Let's go to last week's Prezi, getting inside Pro Tools. That lesson was super duper long. Like I said, it was all naming, so we wanted to make sure we know our file structure. So when you have a Pro Tools session, when that's created, you know all your different file types. So you have your main session folder. You look inside there. You have your PTX, your wave cache, as well as your audio files, where your audio files are stored. So it's really important to know, like I said, if you were to just leave somewhere, you just take this .ptx and you just copy that over to your USB drive, and then you go to like a different computer, different studio, then all of a sudden none of your stuff opens up. All your audio files, they're kept inside the audio files folder. So you always want to make sure you grab this main session folder right here, because it has everything inside of it. So let's go back to content real quick. Let's do a quick review, and then I'll take some lab 1 questions. So let's go back to week number 3. Lesson 2 Prezi. So lesson 2, getting inside Pro Tools. Some of this will be covered on today's little quiz. Make sure you know what the little pictures look like and what everything does. So let's skip ahead right here. Target systems. So like I said, your PTX is just the roadmap. That's the key little phrase there. It contains a map to all your tracks, audio, video files, settings, and all your edits associated with your session. Digital editing is non-destructive. Your main source file is always kept whole, and your Pro Tools session can just kind of shows where you've done all the hacking and the slashing and crossfades. All that's saved inside your Pro Tools session. Your wave cache, like I said, it's useless. Well, it's not useless. If you were to take this guy, you can say delete, and then next time I open up my Pro Tools session, that file will reappear, but the little WAV files will take a little bit longer to load up. I'm still talking with my hands, even though you guys can't see me. It's very, very, very weird. So your audio files, that is anytime you record inside your session, which we'll talk about maybe today, most likely next week. Part of lab number 2 is looking into recording and all that good stuff. So next week we'll hook up an H6 and record some audio inside Pro Tools. So anytime you record into Pro Tools, all that is kept inside that audio files folder. Your MIDI files, so anytime you create a little MIDI, if you're a keyboard player, that is stored inside your Pro Tools session, not like your audio. There is no MIDI folder, so it's just information about your performance. It's the best way to describe MIDI. So if you play a C major chord and you hit it really, really hard, it's going to measure that with whatever, if you have like a little fake piano, it's going to look at that. Sibelius, if you're a composer, when you play that fancy little C chord, it'll actually notate it out. So if you wanted to have you can kind of maybe fudge your way on a piano, but like you got like cheesy sounds, you're doing like a musical score, you play like your little love song for your little kissy scene or whatever. You can take that. It'll make a score, even though you played it on a keyboard and it sounds super cheesy and fake. You can actually take it, say, like a violin player, and then you can give them the notation, the actual notes of what you played, and then they can play it, and you can throw a mic on it, and it sounds more realistic because it's actually real. Bounced files. We're going to have to do some bounce to disk in lab number 2. So we'll talk about that later. But anytime you bounce the disk, if you remember me saying, is the same as like a mix down. Like when you render a file out of your video, that's basically what it's like. Let's go to the next one. Clip groups. Clip groups are fun. They basically take clips are in Pro Tools are like that little actual what you see on your screen. Let's open up a session real quick. Open up this recent one. These little guys. That's why this is called your clip list, because these are clips. These are clips. This is your clip list. And so what you could do is you can create a clip group. Clip group. So there's a clip group. So now it's, instead of 2 little separate clips, it's like one little giant block. And I use clip groups kind of like with, I mentioned when you're doing sound design, you want to kind of like layer your stuff. So you kind of stack it all up. Like if you're doing a punch, you have like a low end. I have not released the password yet. So if you're doing sound design, You have like your top end, your low, your mid. You have all these different little sounds that kind of make the whole file just kind of pop. So you can kind of stack those up, and then you can make it into a group, and it slides around easier than just kind of grabbing everything and going like that. Rendered files, that's if you're working on Elastic Audio. Elastic Audio is if you stretch some stuff. You can move it back and forth, and then while you're working on it, it's in your rendered files, and then once you get done, you say commit, and that'll actually put it inside your audio files folder. If auto backup is enabled, the session file backups will be created automatically, so that's great. Let's go take a look at where that is kept. Preferences. Let's see if they changed it around. And auto backup, there it is. So you can enable session file auto backup. So it's going to back up every 5 minutes, and it's going to keep your 10 most recent backup sessions. I believe that number can go up to 60. Nope, it can go up way higher than that. That's a lot of sessions to back up. Video files, as I mentioned before, we'll take a look at this. Whenever you import video files, they actually do not copy over into your video files folder. So I'm not even really sure why a video files folder is created. It seems kind of useless. But you got to copy it to your video files first, and then import the video into Pro Tools, and it will reference it from your main session folder. So just depending on your hardware, what you're starting up Pro Tools, it's going to just kind of depend on how Pro Tools is going to kind of start up with like your different devices. I have a Avid 002. Actually, it's a DigiDesign 002. It's super old. It's not even supported anymore, but I'm cheap, and that's what I got. I also have an Zoom F4 that I use as well. And at the moment, this microphone is going through like a little Behringer audio board into my main sound card. And it just seemed the easiest to do, except for the light hissing noise. That's driving me bonkers. You need a Pace iLok. That's like Pro Tools 11. He must have forgot to take the slide out, whoever made this. They had the Cloud iLok now. Some of you guys have purchased Pro Tools and know all about that. So let's take a look at optimizing Pro Tools, hardware buffer size, and all that kind of good stuff real quick. It's a good thing to know. So the hardware buffer size, the main things you want to know about this is good quiz-worthy material. The lower the buffer size, the better for recording, so that's going to cause less latency. If you can think about it as when you're recording, you have all your audio going into your computer, it's being processed, and then it's being spit out your speakers. So when you're talking, you want to have less delay, because it's like super duper trippy if your singer is singing or you're talking into a microphone and there's like a little bit of delay. There's like actually like an app where you put headphones in, and then you're talking to your phone, and it makes you sound like you're drunk or something. And it's like, it's super duper trippy. Just like Google it. Like, it does like weird little things with your brain, because it like slows down. It like sounds like you're slurring your speech, because it's just slowing it down just a little bit than what you're actually saying. And it's really hard to talk when you don't hear everything right. So to lower the buffer size, reduces monitoring latency, and it's useful when recording live input, so that's going to cause less of a delay of the signal. And then you want a higher hardware buffer size when you mix. You're doing like lots of processing, because processing is going to take more computer power. So that audio is going to go through this plugin, depending on how many plugins you have. It could go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plugins that you have inserted. onto your track. So that's going to delay your audio. So you want high buffer size for mixing, low buffer size recording. Remember that, quiz worthy right there, maybe in final exam worthy. If you got the cash money and you got a Pro Tools HD system, hardware buffer size is like super duper low, and you can throw plugins on there and it works out pretty good. So let's go find that in Pro Tools. So I'm going to go to Setup, Playback Engine, and here is my hardware buffer size right here. Now, a good way to hear an example of this is once we get the H6 rocking and rolling next week, is you put your samples like low. Oh, maybe I'm going to crash it. Oh, there it goes. You put it low. You talking to the mic. Put your headphones in, talking to the microphone, and then you kick it up high, and then you'll actually hear that delay because it's only being delayed by 64 samples, which is only like a few seconds. It's like milliseconds. Or it's going to be delayed by 1024 samples. So you kick that up. And sometimes if it yells at you and you got your buffer size all the way up, Pro Tools will say, hey, your buffer size is too low, and you're like, I can't go any higher. Sometimes if you kick it back down, then you kick it back up, and it makes Pro Tools happy. So that's where you find your hardware buffer size. So low for recording, high for mixing. And that's Setup, Playback Engine, hardware buffer size. Do, 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 do. Dynamic plugin processing. So it's new in Pro Tools 11. Maximizes the plugin count by dynamically reallocating host-based processing resources as needed. So how it used to work is if you put a plugin on a track, like so, let's just put this guy here. Let's make it active. So if this plugin was on the track, it was always on. You can see if I zoom out, if that was the only thing on this track, the plugin would be active the whole time. This is just blank. But now with this dynamic plugin processing, it's actually going to shut that off and not take any computer processing power until it gets to this clip right here. Speech Jammer, yeah, that's what it's called. So it's fun, it's handy dandy, speeds up Pro Tools, works better with your processing power. A lot of the plugins can take up a lot of juice on your computer. That's what we looked at. So let's take a quick look at the menu structure. We're just gonna touch on the basics. I'm not gonna touch on like every single little thing, but it kind of helps you out just so you know where you're going. So file menu, it's got your basics: opening, creating, saving sessions, and this is where you're gonna find your bouncing tracks. That's where you're gonna do your bounce to disk, as well as importing and exporting session components. So there's file menu. You can see right here, bounce to disk, or if you're doing a video, this is bounce to QuickTime. Import, so this is where lab number 1, if you've done lab number 1, you can do audio, MIDI, video, clip groups. So we looked at clip groups before, so you can create a clip group and you can actually import it. So if you got your favorite gunshot sound, your favorite punch, explosion kind of sound design setup, you can actually import that as a clip group. And this is where you export, but the main things that we're going to do: save, the all-important save. It's like I mentioned before, I got a nervous tick where I always hit, in the Mac world, was Command S or Control S for the Windows world. Use the Control S to always save, or you can go to the file menu and save if you forget Control S. But bounce to disk is important, as well as the import audio stuff. Let's go to the next one. Edit menu. So this is where you can manipulate, copy, paste, duplicate, repeating, shifting, selections, trimming, separating, and healing clips. So if I zoom in on this little clip right here, we go to edit. So there's typical stuff. Copy, cut, does pretty much like what a word processor would do. So you go cut, Control V, paste, copy C as I'm moving. So lab number 1, we talked about our edit cursor. That's this little blinking line found in the middle. Wherever you place that, hit Control V, that's where it's going to place your clip. Go to edit. You have your separate clip. And it says at selection. So wherever your selector tool is located, this is kind of like the razor tool. So if I put my cursor right there, I hit Control plus E, it cuts my clip. If I highlight over that, do Control H. That's the heal command it mentioned. Heal, not like heal, heal. Right there, heal separation. And that only works if it's in the exact same spot it was before. So if you move this over top and you try to do Control H, it doesn't work. It has to be kind of like in its original position. It's like if you do an edit, then you change your mind, and you've done some other steps where you just can't you can't go back and undo it. You just heal it back up. Duplicate, Control D. That one's fine. Working with samples like drums, make a beat. You can do it by bars. So you just duplicate the clip. Control D. That's all I'm doing. Control D. And those are the fun ones. Repeat. It's kind of like the same thing. So that one's Alt R. Or Option R on the Mac. So Alt and R. And this will actually ask you how many times you want to repeat it. So let's repeat that 4 times. And it repeats it 4 times. So that's a good one there. Let's look at the next guy. View menu. So this is going to toggle your different views. So this one's pretty important right here. So if we go to the view menu, you can see right here, when we start up a session, if you start up just blank, it might just look like this. It's not going to have any of that extra goodies on there for you to see. Don't know if Control H is going to work on your parents' message, Jacob. Let's do view. So that's where all those goodies were. You can have comments, view. The main thing we want to look at is inserts and sends. Those are going to be 2 of the first things that we will use in lab number 4. Inserts and sends, or you can right click right here. And this will bring up like a little menu, or there's a fun little drop down guy right here that's handy dandy to use as well. If you hold down Alt or Option, if you're on a Mac, that will just get rid of your views as well. So insert and sends there. So this, if you remember an insert, this is going to be on the quiz. An insert is a patch point that interrupts your audio signal and routes it somewhere else. And then your other displays, your universe, track list, clip list, you can turn all that stuff off. So this is your rulers up here. So right now I'm in minutes and seconds, bars and beats, time code, samples. You can read about all those in your book. Markers and meters. Markers are fun. They help you with session stuff. Let's put a marker in. So you just hit this plus button. And so it's kind of like, I can't remember what the equivalent's called in. You can actually probably you can make them in Media Composer. You probably make markers. So you can just call this like scene 1. Click OK. Now you have a marker. You can actually see where scene 1 is. And it's kind of handy dandy, like if you're in a session, you want to know where the verse is, where the chorus is, pre-chorus, all the different parts of a song. That just helps you give a visual so you can get there quicker. Because if you're working on a song and Mr. Producer sitting behind you, or the band sitting behind you, and they say, okay, let's go back to the chorus and let's record like whatever guitar part. Instead of you just kind of like thinking, oh, where did the chorus start? It was at like it was like in 2 minutes in or something like that. Now you can actually just have a visual and see, oh, there's chorus 1, there's scene number 1. I can go right there, you can go down here. Quick key, enter on the very, very far right on the number pad. You hit enter, and that's going to bring up your new memory location box. So you can call this scene 2. So now you have markers where you can visually see where your scenes start, choruses start, whatever you're working on. And that also goes to, skip ahead to the window menu, go to window, memory locations, and that'll bring up your memory location box. So now I can just click here. You see my edit cursor, wherever it's inserted, it goes back and forth to there. So there's other views you can go and explore. How your clips are displayed, different things like that. So let's look at the track menu. This is where you create new tracks. So if you go to track and new, this is where you can make all your fun and wonderful tracks. So I'm going to go stereo. You can make an aux. Say create. So that creates a new track. You can also group your tracks, which you do in lab number 1. Delete. Delete you cannot undo. So if you delete a track, that is something that cannot be undone. Oh, I hit it. So I usually right click it. And then you say delete. That cannot be undone. So if you had this like a little arrangement of your clips, you had a whole bunch of editing done, and you deleted it, you don't delete the clip, the source file. All your clips are still saved over here, but your arrangement of it is gone. So then you have to go back and find your session, your backups and all that good stuff. Yeah, so that's pretty much the important one there. Clip. So again, we kind of look really quick at the grouping of the clips. So if you go to clip, you have one selected, you can say group it with a different one. You could loop it. There is the clip gain. So there's a little line right here, or a little fader. That's actually in the view. Clip gain line. And that's kind of like automation done on the clip. But that's before if you were to think about it as a mixer, that's pre-fader. So if you mix with the clip gain, that's all pre-fader before it happens right there. So if you wanted this little spot, half of this to be lowered, you could go like that. See if I got it working.
He says some weird things sometimes.
So it's kind of like automation is what I call it. Let's go. Let's make sure we're keeping track here. Clips. Events. We'll get into this lab number 3, the MIDI menu. Go up here, you'll do a whole bunch of quantizing. That's where if you suck at your little piano song that you made up for your mom, you can quantize it and make yourself play better. Beat detective, if you have a drum, you got playing a drum, You can tell them to detect the beat, and you can make Pro Tools, hopefully make them play better. It takes a little bit of work, but it's supposed to be automatic, but it takes a little bit of work. Those are fun things found there. Audio Suite menu. Let's take a look at that one. So an insert is real time. It's non-destructive. So when I have it inserted onto this track, let's make it sound super duper crappy here. Whoop.
He says some weird things sometimes.
Let's see where my volume is. Mute the speakers. It's a good podcasting here. Oh, I know what's up. I know what's up. Change the I/O here. Got it coming out a different input. There we go. 7 and 8.
He says some weird things. He says some weird things. He says some weird things. He says some weird things.
It's a remix. Alrighty, so back to where we were. So here's bypassed.
He says some weird things. He says some weird things. He says some weird things.
Then we put the plugin on there.
He says some
Take
weird
out all
things.
the low,
He says some
high
weird
end.
things.
Our clip doesn't change. So if I can get rid of this insert, this plugin,
He says some weird things sometimes.
the audio stays the same. However, if I select that clip and I go to the Audio Suite menu, then I say I do the same thing. I need a band like Jimmy Fallon where they're just like the Roots playing behind me like while I'm doing this stuff. And then I say render. So this is going to make a whole brand new file. So you see the name. This is the name of our clip found right there. You can also see the name whenever I select a clip. You can see it selecting over here. I'm going to say render. And then the name of the clip changed. It also made a brand new spanking clip in our audio files folder. And you can also see that it changed. So then I close this guy. There's no insert. I hit play.
He says some weird things sometimes.
And then it sounds filtered. So then I actually have to, I can bring in the original clip is this one. Yes.
He says some things.
Nope. That was an old take. I'm not sure where the original clip was, what number it was. We'll just undo. There we go. This guy. So then I hit
He
play.
says some weird things sometimes.
And there's all sorts of goodies you can do up in here. So that's good if you're doing sound design and you only want to affect like one little clip. So it's like, or without affecting, like you have a whole bunch of like different little takes on a track. You can just affect that one little thing. And you can, just depending on your different takes. So let's bring in this guy. This is the original audio. Change our output to 7 and 8.
He said.
Oh, that's lovely. You can hear right here, there's like a little splice of the audio.
He says some weird things sometimes. See? Penny is helping better the world. How was Wandering doing anything?
So you can hear right here, there's a little shift in like in the low end. It goes. You might have to kind of EQ it differently. So if you cut it in half, you can come up to your Audio Suite menu, do some EQing on this clip versus this, or you can just go back and you can do some ADR and make it sound better that way. But pretty much every single plugin that you have available to you should be available to you in the Audio Suite menu. There might even be some other ones as well. Yeah, like the DC offset removal. So if you got like a buzz, you can do that guy. It might take out so if there's like a humming, buzz, anything like that, you could try that out and see if that works for you. Most of that I do in what's it called, Audition. It's a little bit better for that, like cleaning up your audio, than Pro Tools. Let's keep going. Options. Got lots of options. Pre, post roll. Loop playback. That's a good one to know. So if you want it to always loop, when you're working in audio, you listen to it way too much. Just kind of like when you're doing a video edit, you'll watch your edit like 100,000 times, and you'll make one tiny little move, then you watch it like another 100,000 times. So that's kind of like the same thing in audio. You'll listen to it, and it'll go over.
He says some weird things sometimes.
So he just keeps looping back over and over and over again. You can see right here, I usually just right click it, or you can hold.
He says some.
What is it in the Windows world? I can't think of it in the Windows world. Loop. Was it Alt L? Oh, that's loop record. Oh, sorry, that's loop record. Loop playback. Control Shift L. That's what's going on here. Loop record we'll get into when we do ADR for lab number 5. So there's a loop. It'll loop it back and forth. That little arrow tells you that it's looping, and you gotta have more than 5.5 seconds selected. So if your selection's too small, let's see if I can zoom way in there, make it super. You gotta have more than 0.5 seconds.
He says some weird things sometimes.
And it just keeps going. They call this your in and your out markers. Kind of like your in and your out points. So you set you make a selection, which we'll look at later on.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
And it just keeps going over and over again. Let's look what's next. Setup menu, we kind of looked at that really quick. So any hardware, so you can see what hardware you're using. It'll show you your sample rate, what it's clocking off of, and it could, just depending on what your hardware is, what OS you're using, it could be a little bit different. Playback engine, so we can change what our playback device is. So this will make my computer crash because for some reason it's not working right. So you can select that. That's what you should be using in the labs, is a ASIO for all. That makes your world a whole bunch easier working in those Mohawk labs. I/O is important, and it's exactly what it says. It's your inputs and your outputs. So when I'm switching to output number analog 7 and 8, that's where my little audio board that I have plugged into my sound card that's streaming, that's where it's plugged into, because I have available 18 inputs on my 002. And also I have, so here's my outputs. So I have 18 outputs. So these are my inputs. I can record 18 things on separate microphones all in one go. And then my outputs, I can have 18 different tracks routed to 18 little different areas. Or you can see the 7 and 8, that's your analog. 1 and 2, that's my main speaker output. So if my speakers in my room here, I can hear those. And let's take a look at the next. Windows. If you want to get to things like your transport, Control 1 is your quick key for the Pro Tools Ninjas. Control plus equals, that'll toggle between your edit and your mix window. So those are your two main windows that you're going to work out of. Control plus 1, he's up here, drag him down. That's your transport. You also noticed that the transport is up here as well. This little button right here, that'll toggle your transport on and off. So if you don't see your transport up here at the top, you can toggle it on and off right there. Hit play, pause. If you haven't figured it out already, spacebar plays and stops as well. Also got to the memory locations menu there. And then you can also create custom arrangements, kind of like tile stuff and tile vertical, whatever you want to do. You can kind of do it like that. However you want to work, you set up your space. The new workspace, we'll get into that when we do just a little bit more sound design. It's basically like a browser for Pro Tools, kind of like the bin thing in Adobe, where you have like a little browser down here and you go through searching for all your media. It's kind of like what this is. It's gotten a lot better. Back in the day, it used to just always crash Pro Tools, but since Pro Tools 11, they started redoing it, and it's got a lot better. I don't have my sound catalog set up on my Windows computer yet, but usually I have a catalog set up and it's got all my sound files. So I can go in there and find car crashes, bonks, and footsteps. It's always footsteps. Lots and lots of footsteps. And the marketplace, that's where they're going to take your money. Help menu is your best friend. You go to help, Pro Tools knowledge base. Click on help again. You need an internet connection. And now you can go search. You can say help me out with my edit modes. And this will bring up pretty much like the user manual. So you can say edit modes and edit tools. And hey, look, tells you what they are, quick keys. Click on the next one. Tells you what it is, gives you a little definition, pretty little picture, all that good stuff. Hey, speaking of edit modes, let's talk about them real quick. Good segue. So your edit modes, slip, this one allows you to move freely. Shuffle, if I have more than one, let's put another one here. So if I'm on slip, this guy will go over top that one, but in shuffle, they're constrained by the other ones. Spot, this one will open up a dialog box. So this is originally timestamped. We talk about metadata with audio. So its original timestamp is at 27:04.355. That's in 27 minutes 4 seconds. So I click OK. And now, there we go. Now I click OK. Now you can see right here, this is your main time scale. So wherever your edit cursor is located, or if you click on a clip, it'll show you where the beginning of it starts. So there's time, and you can also view that in time code. So if you want to think in time code, you can do that as well. So I'll go to spot, and it'll show me the time code here. And you click that button, it'll make it go to where it's supposed to go. So now that's where all these guys should align. Do the same thing for these. Put it back where they're supposed to live. Go back to slip. Whoop, 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 whoop. I'm going back here. Just a little bit.
He says some weird things sometimes. Penny is helping better the world. How was wandering doing anything for anybody?
So that kind of lines it up. The actor wasn't like exact, so, but it gets it back to where it was. So that's the fun spot menu, and then grid. You can see there's little blue lines appear. Now your clip movement is constrained, and it snaps. That's the key word. It snaps to the nearest increment. So if it's right here, this turns on and off your grid line. So if you actually don't see those blue lines, you click your show and hide grid button right there. And so that's set to a second. You can go to frames. So this is half a frame. If you want to move something half a frame, that'll work. Or you can go back to bars and beats if you're doing music stuff. So you can move something by an eighth note. So if you're doing MIDI, you can move it by constrained proportions that way. It's fun stuff, right? So those are your edit modes. We'll get more into those, I believe, a little bit later. It didn't go into too much detail, but there might be some stuff about that on the quiz. Tools, edit tools, that's on the quiz. So it just kind of defined it really quick in lab number 2, or lesson 2, what each tool was. So this one right here, this is your selector tool. So if you just have one selected, like so, it always stays as your selector tool no matter where you are in the track. So this places your cursor wherever it's going to be. So in, say, lab number 1, I said place your edit cursor at this point, hit play, and then you hit stop. Where does your edit marker end up after that? The line that appears after you hit play, that's your playback marker. Well, the school is closing, that's correct. Well, you guys almost got, you don't want a slumber party at school? So, the password is, let's bring up a little Word file. I might have to go and change it. Pro Fools. So that's your password. I think that's also my old school Xbox gamer tab. It's been a while since I played Xbox Live. So that's your selector tool. Your trim tool. You trim your clips left and right. Grabber guy. He moves your clips, and then if you click this little bar right here, this is your super tool. So it depends on where your cursor goes. So down here it's your grabber, up here it's your selector, here is your trim tool, and this way is your trim tool as well. So that's kind of like lesson 2. Those are kind of the important things. So let's look at this week. For lab number 2, this is kind of like where I make you kind of listen like an audio engineer. So I kind of got this little thing set up right here. This is how to listen. So you guys can, if you're still around, not doing the quiz, you can answer some of this. So sonically is kind of like how you should listen when you're kind of like listening as an audio engineer. You don't think about the performance. A lot of people, yeah, fat is good. Fat is a good way to describe the sound. Sonically, you want to listen to it, how does it sound, not like performance-wise, because performance might suck, but sonically, maybe it still sounds good. So you can see right here on my screen, I have like a few words that kind of describe it, how you can describe a sound, because most people, they can't say, oh, that frequency at 2 kilohertz is really bugging me, can you turn it down? Usually people just say, hey, that sounds too bright. Hey, that sounds really muddy. Sounds really bright, dull, bassy, fat, your choice, whichever one. Dry, so that's kind of like reverby. Wet, dry and wet is kind of like reverb terms. So if some, say you got somebody standing in a big room, and you have them mic'd up, and all of a sudden they sound like super echoey. That almost sounds like a wet version of kind of like how reverb would describe too much reverb. Dry is it like really close. They have like no room tone, no like ambient sound to it at all. Hollow sounds like it's kind of like, I'd almost sound like hollow is like somebody's like speaking through a cardboard tube, or even muffled, where you take all the high end out. Like if I reach down here, take out all the high end out of my microphone, that's kind of muffled. I can make it sound boxy. This is kind of boxy. I take all the high end out and all the low end out, and I kind of sound like I'm on an old timey radio. And then you kind of add in too much bass down here, causes it to sound just like a little bit more, a different kind of way of muffled, because I got all the high end gone but too much bass, so then it just sounds like a super duper low end. So then I kind of try to get it back to where it was, just a little bit right, maybe there ish, distorted. So if your audio is peaking too much, it could be distorted, echoey. That's kind of like you're dry and you're wet. That's like if somebody's in the room. And we got any other terms to describe audio, maybe, that you've heard? Don't be scared. I'm not sure how long the delay. Crisp. Oh, that's a good one. Crisp is kind of like, you get like a really nice hi-hat sound if you're into making music. Crisp is good, or when something just sounds like just right. It's crisp. Shrill, yeah. Pungent. You got some stinky audio, some stanky audio or something. So that just kind of helps when you're kind of like working with non-audio people, or you're like a non-audio person, how you can kind of maybe communicate with your audio mixer. You could say like, hey, you know, it sounds too bright, it sounds too brittle, it sounds too muddy, when you're like listening back to something that somebody's either mixed or recorded. That's how I could spell tinny like that. Yeah, tinny's good. So yeah, brittle, I kind of broke it down to the actual frequencies. So 2K to 4K, you have too much of that, your sound could sound a little bit brittle. So let's go back to that good old phrase and listen to it a couple hundred more times here. So I'm going to load up an EQ real quick. My microphone's bugging me because it doesn't sound the same as it did. Let's see, right here. So 2 to 4K. They're universal. They're kind of just, it's, some guys might interpret it differently, but if you kind of think like brittle, you can do that. Muddy, kind of that 200 and 900 hertz, that would be considered your mud. Like if you kind of got an audio engineer and you said, you know, that sounds muddy, he would kind of go to that, maybe that range right there. Bright, 5K to 20K, and then bassy, bass, 40 hertz to 200 hertz. If something sounds like super bassy, rumbly, kind of like that. So let's go here. I'm going to boost at, let's go in between that at 3000 hertz. So that's 3K. So let's hear what it sounds like before.
He says some weird things sometime. He says some weird things sometime. He says some weird things sometime. He says some weird things sometime.
Ouch, that hurts my ears. Gets like really piercing. Kind of like if you really boost that 3K too much.
He says some weird things sometime. He says some weird things sometime.
You can hear our S's kind of get like a little bit more.
He says some weird things sometime.
Versus you bypass. So this is your bypass button. You can turn on and off.
He says some weird things sometime. He says some weird things sometime.
It's kind of like, I like your word shrill. He does say some weird things sometimes. Like I said, you listen to something like 100,000 million times. So muddy 200 hertz to 900 hertz. Let's give it like a little boost there. See what that sounds like. So there's 200. Let's boost it up
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So you can see right there, that kind of catches her low end. She sounds like she's like got her hand in front of her face like this.
He says some weird things sometimes.
Take it off.
He says some weird things sometimes.
And even she is a little bit thin, wherever the mic placement was on this. Sometimes you do want to give it like a little boost at 200, but too much makes it sound muddy.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird.
But at this 200 hertz, you can actually add some fullness to somebody who's speaking. So if we just give it like maybe like a 3 dB boost.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some.
Then she sounds like a little bit fuller, and she doesn't sound as thin. But if you give it too much of a boost,
he says some weird things sometimes.
Then she sounds like she's got her hand in front of her face and she's muffled. Exactly like a Bane mask. Bane! Just like that. And bright. 5K-ish. So let's use like a high shelf. Remember these are parametric EQs. This is my Q. This determines how wide, how narrow. So we're going to talk about search and destroying here in a minute. So that's wide is small Q. It's going to boost a whole bunch of frequencies, and you narrow it up. That's only going to boost a little bit of frequencies.
He says some weird.
And that's your parametric EQ. So I'm going to go down here to my shelf. Let's do 6K.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So that really kind of brings out the hiss in the audio track, her S's.
He says some.
But again, you add a little bit of it.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird.
And she sounds a little bit clearer. Same thing right here. We go back to our 200 hertz. Give it a nice little boost around 3 dB.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says.
Throw on a de-esser later on in life.
He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some weird things sometimes.
And she sounds like a little bit clearer. This is probably too much.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says.
Bring it down just a bit.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says.
He says some weird things sometimes. So those are just kind of like your generic terms that you can work with. Again, I mentioned wet is kind of like room tone. So I'm maybe like a foot away from my mic. So if I kind of back off just a little bit, you can hear a little bit more in my room. So that's kind of added in that room tone right there. Got like a little bit more space. The echoes, it's bouncing off the walls and also going back into the mic. But what you can do is you can actually search for the room tone and you can take it out. So if we go back to our remix here, listen to it a couple hundred more times. Just going to go back to the flat default EQ. And we're going to use our search and destroy method. So just kind of like what I talk about. You want to use a very high Q. You want to make it narrow. And what we're going to do is we're going to sweep it back and forth until we find a frequency that just kind of jumps out at us and we're like, ugh. And this takes practice. This takes ear training. You're not going to watch this video then all of a sudden go and do it unless like you're kind of done it for a while.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So the way I describe what you're listening for is kind of like the straw sucking sound. So right here, 658 hertz.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says.
It kind of almost sounds like she's going like this with her hands like around her mouth. It sounds like that. It really just kind of accentuates the room tone.
He says some weird things.
So you boost it where it sounds like super duper nasty. And you're like, Jim, everything sounds nasty. And that's just where the practice comes from. Is you wait for that tone that just kind of really jumps out. So let's do it again.
He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some weird things sometimes.
So you can really hear something catching right there. Whatever, I think it's called a car scene. So she's sitting in a car. So there must be some sort of reflection coming off of something or wherever the mic is hooked up. That frequency is getting boosted because of whatever room she's sitting in, whatever she's sitting next to is taking that frequency and amplifying it. So it's like, whoom, whoom, whenever.
He says some weird things sometimes.
So you can hear that little tone get louder.
He says some weird things sometimes.
So we're just going to bloop, drop her down maybe like 3 dB. It's always kind of good to start small.
He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some weird things sometimes.
So that just kind of smooths it out just a little bit. It's very, very, very subtle once you do take it out, but you don't hear that little that little catch. And so now what you do is good old math. So let's make it even. So let's say instead of like 253, let's make it 250 straight up. So you double 250. That's about 500 hertz. I don't know if that one can go that high. So then you double it and then you take it out.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says
double 500, that's 1,000. Narrow your Q, drop her down just a few dB. So this is going to take out, this is what they call overtones. You double the frequency, you have the fundamental that we found. You double it, and that takes out all the fundamentals.
He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some.
You could do double 2,000.
He says some weird things. He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some weird things.
That's a lot. It's very, very subtle, but as soon as you do that, it gets a little bit smoother once you do that. Let's go back and look again. Hollow, as a term we used up there. So you have too much mid-range, low mid-range, 900, 200 hertz to 800 hertz, boxy. That's kind of like that. You got your hands in front of your face, your Bane mask. You reduce these frequencies to remove boxiness sounds, so you always kind of use that narrow one to remove it. And this is kind of important. Your speaking voices, to actually understand what we're saying, this is the frequencies that you need. You need 300 hertz to 3400 hertz to actually understand what you're saying. So if you think about how phone calls used to sound like back in the day, that's kind of like the bandwidth they use, is that 300 hertz to 3400 hertz. Once you kind of lose those, it's kind of gets a little bit harder. People don't become as clear. So if those frequencies are just kind of like taken out, then all of a sudden somebody gets harder to understand. So let's say 300. We're going to use a filter. Remember, high pass filter lets all your highs pass. Low pass filter makes all your lows pass. 3400, bring that in.
Some weird things sometimes.
Let's listen to what this is.
How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
With this
How
tiger.
is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
She gets quieter. You can't really hear
How
her.
is wandering?
You can start boosting the volume of it so you can understand what she's saying.
How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing?
Let's keep on going. Your present range, 2 to 4K. So this is, you boost this for more clarity in speech, but you don't want to do it too much in this range because it can cause ear fatigue. We're more sensitive to this frequency range. Your 2K to 4K, so like your baby's crying and all that kind of stuff, this is where we're most sensitive to frequencies. So if you boost it, you're just kind of having a hard time understanding what somebody's saying. You got like a little background music going. If you boost what they're saying at 2K to 4K, it'll kind of make it their clarity. You do the same thing for vocals. You boost that a little bit, and it just kind of makes it where they pop out of the mix just a little bit more. So kind of like right there, but like I said, you don't want to do too much.
Says some weird things sometimes.
Oh, because all of a sudden it's just like, holy smokes. You just boost it just a bit.
Says some weird things sometimes. How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
So when you boost it, you can kind of understand her just a little bit better. She's just a little bit easier to hear. So your de-esser is a frequency-specific compressor. So this is handy dandy. Let's take a look at your de-esser here. So I'm going to go to plug-in. So it messes my inserts. I click one of these empty little slots, plug-in, dynamics, and then I want a de-esser.
How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
Let's go back to he says, because it's going to happen. She got that big ass in there. So let's take
He
a look.
says some weird things sometimes.
So what this does is a compressor we kind of talked about before. It looks at your peaks. You have your ratios. And it says, if I go over above this threshold, then I'm going to bring down the audio. So you set your range is kind of like your threshold. You say, okay, if anything at 7K goes above this range right here, bring down the volume of it. So let's see how it does.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
Bypass it.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So that just brings down the volume of her S's. If you say listen,
He says some weird things sometimes.
you're listening specifically at that frequency. So if we
He
just
says some weird things sometimes. He 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 says some weird things sometimes.
so just kind of depending what's bugging you the
He
worst.
says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
But you don't want to do it too much because then you make it sound like somebody has a lisp.
He says some weird things sometimes.
And it sounds awful.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So that's de-esser. Let's take a quick look at a compressor real quick. This is a good one. You'll do this a lot in lab number 2. So compressor, mentioned before.
He says some weird things sometimes.
You have your different elements, your threshold. That's when your compressor is going to start working. Your attack, how quick it's going to start working. Your release, how long it stays compressed, and your ratio determines your amount. So 2-to-1 says for every 2 decibels, you're only going to let 1 decibel out. Your knee kind of determines how much it goes into compression. There is a Prezi online that you can look at that goes into more detail about these. So let's compress this girl's little stuff
He
here.
says some weird things sometimes.
So what you can do is you bring down the threshold.
He says some weird.
You can see even right here, this gives you like a little readout. As soon as it goes over that little
He
line,
says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
in this GR meters, your gain reduction, how much reduction's actually happening.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some.
Let's do a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every 3 decibels over, you're only getting 1 decibel back out. So you're lowering the volume by 2 decibels essentially.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
So now you can actually, if you do it too much, it lowers the volume too much.
He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes. He says some weird things sometimes.
Really what you want to do is you want to make it hit around minus 3 dB.
He says some weird things sometimes.
So you bring it down 3 decibel, and then you bring it back up.
He says some weird things sometimes. 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 He says some weird things sometimes.
He says some weird things sometimes.
How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody? How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
So it just gives it a little bit boost, kind of evens out your audio. If you make it too quick,
How is wandering doing anything for anybody?
what's going to happen, let's bring in this little snare, kind of give it like a little visual for you to see. Oh, it sounds like my children are home. Whoop. Went to a Mac. So this is good old snare hit. There's the beat. It's being dropped. So you can visually see the snare. These are your transients. So your transient is the beginning of your sound. All sounds have a transient. So snare, drums have very defined transients. If we go over here to her, what she's saying, you can see that it's not too defined, but they're still kind of there.
How it's wandering.
So the how, there's the beginning of your H, how. And then if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see the S's.
How it's wandering, doing it.
Let's go over back to here and look at the S, because the S is very defined. Or not really defined, it's just kind of like basically fuzz, so that's an S right there. Those are good places to make edits right there.
He says some.
So if you want to shorten something up, you just cut it like that and go.
He says some weird things sometimes.
And then hide your edit. So that's what S's look like. There's your transients for your kind of like speech. So those are kind of like ways you can use to line up if you're doing like ADR or anything like that. So drums are good because they have a big defined transient. So there's an initial hit and there's the decay of it. So we're going to go to our audio suite menu. We're actually going to visually see what compression is doing. So let's just smash it good with a very, very, very quick attack. Let's listen. That's going through options. Oh, there's my audition path. Missed it. Bypass it. So I'm going to say render. So now you see that transient. What happened to your transient just kind of like went away. Very flat, very dull sounding. But now if I bring back the attack by say like 30 milliseconds. So it's 30 milliseconds in, it still leaves that attack of that sound, and then it brings up the decay. So look at, so that's how it kind of shapes your sound. Let's make the release a little bit longer. Let's see how that changes it. Make it super duper long. So you can see how it's kind of changing the shape of your sound, and with your slower attack, it really lets that transient through. So that's if you load up a compressor and your attack's too quick, you're actually going to make a lot of your speech, your audio, whatever you're doing, it's going to make it sound not as defined, because that initial attack of a sound is kind of like where we get our tangibility of speech. So your T's, everything, how it begins, all your letters. If your attack is too quick, that's going to make it sound dull and hard to understand. Let's see, what else we want to look at? So that's compression. Expander. You'll learn more about that in lab number 2. I won't go through that right now. But the main thing to kind of really think about is how you listen. I know it's kind of just like, you're like, Jim, I don't hear anything that you did. It just sounds all the same. It's kind of like video editing, getting all your shots right. It's all about practice, and how listening. You just do it a lot. It's like there's actually programs you can get to get better. Quiz Tones is a good one to kind of like train your ear. They'll inject frequencies like with other audio, and you have to kind of pick out all the different stuff that's going on. I don't know if you can hear my kids. I can hear my kids upstairs now. School's out. So you can practice that, and it's all just kind of going through with the the EQ, searching, destroying frequencies, and seeing if it sounds better. And it's always like you sit here, you spend a whole bunch of time, you EQ, and when you listen a lot, it causes ear fatigue. So then you don't hear the same as you did when you first started. You get tired, then you're like, oh, it sounds awful. And then you leave, you come back, and you're like, hey, that actually sounds pretty good. Or you leave, you think it sounds good, and then you come back, and you're like, holy smokes, what is going on? That sounds awful. It could be something like that. So it's all about practice, and it's all about, it breaks. You do a little bit of work, you come back, you listen, you play it in systems that you're familiar with. I talked about getting a good set of headphones. You don't have to go out and break the bank, get a pair of $500 Grados. You just have to get some decent ones that do the full audio spectrum, so you can hear the low end, the high end, and it has a decent mid-range. But you get used to listening on whatever headphones that you buy. Like you listen to professional mixes on it, you reference those. And then you can interpret what your work sounds like in your headphones. So you can go out and get like a pair of $200, $100 headphones. As long as you're listening to professionally done products that you know that sounds good, then you go listen to your stuff and you try to match it. That's where your headphones kind of come in. That's how you kind of train your ears. Whenever I do a mix for somebody, I'll be like, what do you want it to sound like? Do you want it to sound like Nickelback? Everybody's like, I want it to sound like Nickelback. You're like, oh, that's a lot of money, but we can go that way. Very overproduced sounding kind of thing, or they want to sound like Whitney Houston kind of thing. So then you go back and you reference Nickelback songs or Whitney Houston songs, whatever you want to do, however they want their mix to sound. So they reference things like all that. Let's see. So that's how to listen. This is actually a pretty good way to teach this lesson, because maybe you're sitting there with a pair of headphones in. You can actually kind of hear this. We're not stuck in the lab with the high fidelity speakers that are working, that are great for listening, right? So that is kind of like how to listen. That's under lab 2, and that was quite a while. So actually lab number 2. So if you finish lab number 1 and you want to get going on this one, feel free. It's kind of like a 2-parter. It's pretty long, so you can kind of think about it in 2 parts. I was going to have you get together in groups and define all this stuff, so you can work with some classmates, look up these definitions, define it. And it's basically like lab number 1. I'm going to take you through some ear training exercises, kind of like different little things, different little techniques you're going to play around with, kind of like what I just did, the ratios, attack and releases. You're going to play around with all that, expanders and gates. Expanders, great, especially for live stuff. Doing like news, you want to cut out the noise floor. So when I stop talking, there's still that little bit of hiss, whatever is going on in my little audio board, or my microphone, power, or whatever. HVAC system, furnace is going on down in the basement, it's freezing cold. But I stop talking, there's still that noise there. But if you want that to go away, you can, instead of you as an engineer always bringing your finger up and down, an expander will do that automatically, or a gate will as well. De-esser, we looked at that. EQ, we'll go through, it'll take you through some more EQ steps, and there's lots of fun spelling mistakes. I'm sorry, I'm human. So you'll find those on there. Limiters, they'll be on there. And then there's some more little stuff. And then don't worry about the hands-on. We'll talk about this next week, how to actually record into Pro Tools, and then you get to make it sound good. So that's lab number 2 in a nutshell. There's a session to go along with it. So there's actually files. So you download the zip file, and it'll open up and take you through everything that you need to do lab 2. Here's a fun little video I made talking about bouncing, all that good stuff. You have to download it. And then if you want some more samples to play around, I'm not really sure what's in here. Let's find out. Let's extract that. There's a kick drum and a snare drum. So you can play around with a kick or a snare with the EQ. Let's go back here to content. So Lab 2 is due. I think I had it due on. Oh, I am there. February 11th. When is that? So that's a few weeks away. So next week we'll get together. We'll talk about how to record in there, and then lab number 2 we'll do on the 11th. So we got some time. You can start on the first part. Like I said, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Lab, just not do it the night before, because like I said, it's a lot of listening. For those of you that are interested in lab stuff, audio stuff, then you can take your time, go through that, and kind of listen. I try to do individual feedback as best as I can. If you do something wrong, I'm going through your videos right now, listening to those, learning all about you guys. But I do try to give individual feedback, but for the most part I kind of have a rubric set up. You can kind of read the rubric, and then anything specific you ever want to know, you can always ask me. The question was, do I give individual feedback on labs? So, time is it? 4:20. Any questions about lab number 1? Thoughts, feelings, concerns? My daughter is not happy. I can hear her upstairs. No questions? Probably the mock stuff. No, that's advanced post audio. So much stuff. Probably the one. Let's go back. I think I did already open up. Don't save. Oh yeah, lab 2. I mean, lab 2. You'll go through it and you're like, Jim, I didn't hear anything at all. It's like, you're crazy. Like, I didn't hear anything different. But it's all, like I said, it's all about, lab 2 is all about practice. Osman, you did email. It was question 16. Let's go back and look at it. Do. Where did the playback cursor start from? Yep. So these are kind of like, I'll go over like starting at 16. Let's take a look at that real quick. Always fun. So let's load up. It helps. Not only does it help kind of like importing audio, but it's good for practicing other things as well. Where was that audio? Got everything scattered everywhere. I don't have everything organized on this computer yet, and it drives me nuts. It's like I just kind of started up and threw it on there. There we go. American Gigolo. So because this file type is an MP3, it asks us to convert it. So I'm going to click convert. Done. I'm going to say use current folder, so that's going to put it inside my audio files folder. Yep, so this brings us up to this little dialog box. So if it's converted, or if you copy a file, it'll ask these guys right here. So you can either say make a new track or your clip list. So we know our clip list, like we talked about earlier, is this little guy right here. So new track is going to create exactly what it says, a new track. Or if you put it in the clip list, it just brings it over here. If I did it the other way, let's do new track, and you can kind of say where you want it to start at the session start or wherever. Let's do a new track. Stamp that file. It puts it right here. It creates a new track, stereo file. It creates a stereo track exactly for it. I'm actually going to bring the volume down on this because I think it's super duper loud. Actually, if I use my clip gain. Oh, somebody's getting yelled at upstairs. Whoop, that's loud. The textbooks are in. I sent an email and I posted a message on the eLearn. So let's take a look at question 16. Let's mess around with this playback marker. So we said before, so I said, where did this go? So you press the return key. So what the return key does, takes, if your edit cursor is here, it takes your edit cursor all the way back to the front. So that's what the return key or enter key, however you want to say it in the or in Windows, Mac, whatever you're using. So we click the space bar, let it run for a bit, and then we hit the space bar again. So then I hit stop. Where's my edit cursor? Oh, hey, it's back at the front right there. So then I tell you to find move your edit cursor in 20 seconds beginning. Hold your mouse cursor over the audio file until you see your selector. Press space bar. So we go back to this guy. So we want to click this, the insert, timeline insertion follows playback, right there. And we go 20 seconds. So now my edit cursor is about 20 seconds. You can see that up here in my main time scale as well. I'm at 20 seconds. So then when I hit stop now, you can see where's your edit cursor end up now. It goes at 30 seconds. So exactly what this button says, insertion follows playback. So your edit insertion follows your playback marker. So wherever you hit stop is where your edit cursor is going to end up. So sometimes that's handy dandy, sometimes you don't want it to do that. Because if you are listening to your audio track a million times, you make your edit, so you do like an edit, like this is going to be awful, but you do an edit and you're like, let me hear that again. Oh, I got to click back. Let me hear that again. You got to click back. If you take this off, so that just kind of helps you listen to your edits. So when I'm editing, doing this, moving stuff around, I kind of make it like that. But if you want it to follow, kind of like when you're recording, somebody says, hey, stop it right there, let's work on that part, and you just hit stop, and then your edit cursor ends up where you hit stopped. That's basically those. So those kind of get like a little bit weird there, if you're not really sure what you're looking for. Those are probably the trickiest ones. Some people get kind of caught up. The one they get wrong is the copying versus adding. So just make sure you know the difference between copy versus adding when you do that in Pro Tools. You can look that up in your book. We haven't gone through that in the book yet, so you have to maybe go into a chapter ahead somewhere and sneak a peek. Any other questions, thoughts, feelings, concerns? So if you missed it, the quiz the lesson 2 week 3 quiz. The password is ProFools. That'll get you in there. Take the quiz. Let me know how you're doing. Any other questions, feel free to email me. I'll probably wrap it up now. I've been talking for a while. Got the children upstairs now, causing a ruckus, so it's probably a good time to end it. Well, have a good week. Enjoy the snowstorm. If there's anything else you want me to kind of like make a video about, I could probably do like a screen capture or something like that. If there's something else you want me to go over, there's probably a whole bunch of stuff I forgot to talk about that I'll have to kind of go over again. But this kind of keeps us rolling. No snowstorm ain't gonna keep us down. Oh no, we got to keep on moving. So have a good one. Adios.